Hi everyone, welcome to today's MEF webinar. The title is Tackling DCB and Ad Fraud in Content Monetization. I'm Tim Green, I'm the features editor of the MEF and I'll be moderating today. And today's session is largely reflecting on a report that we've just published. And I was the author of that report, and I was asked to come in and look at all the material that the working group on content fraud had gathered together over the last few months. So we republished that report last week, and that's called Combating Fraud in Mobile Content, and you can download that from the MEF website. So I urge you to do that. And today's session is mostly based on the content inside that report. So it's going to be good to go through it all and wade through all the many issues in this space. So we've got about 45 to 50 minutes to discuss this today. I'll remind you that we will be recording this session, so you can catch up with it later or share it with colleagues. And we urge you to ask questions. So if you've got any questions, please click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen and ask questions at any point, and I will make sure I look at that tab throughout and relay your questions to the experts. So with me today, I have Anzelle Robertson, who's the Business Development Manager from Sam Media, and David Lotfi, who's the CEO of Evina.
Hi.
John Tullai, who's the COO of Aegis Mobile.
Hello.
And Oliver Cooke, who's Head of Payments at IMImobile. So we've got an aggregator, we've got a content provider, we've got some technical anti-fraud experts. So a good range of expertise. So I'll start by, let's kind of dig into how serious a problem this is before we get on to sort of defining the different types of fraud. So maybe Oliver, I'll come to you first, given that you're a kind of intermediary in all of this. So how would you characterize the problem of fraud at the moment, and especially with regional variations?
I come at this, certainly for me, very much a UK perspective. So as an aggregator, our expertise is here in the UK. We see fraud as being a problem, certainly. I think one of the issues that we have in the UK market specifically is that we're struggling to quantify the scale. So we know that there is fraud. We know that we have customers who complain. We know we have customers who swear blind that they've not been opted into services, they've never seen the service. So the suspicion may be that a fraud of some form has taken place. Some of the work I'm hoping to do independently from MEF actually is to kind of look at the value chain, looking at fraud blocks, looking at how consumers flow through, and may end up in raising a complaint to either a regulator, an M&O, the service provider, or ourselves as aggregator. Gut feel to me says that fraud is an issue. We're probably looking at maybe 5 to 10%. David's probably got some thoughts on other markets about sort of how that stacks up elsewhere, but from my perspective, that 5 or 10% feels like the sort of level I think that could be generating fraudulent clicks, fraudulent traffic through to service acquisition.
Right. Okay, David. So
yes.
You were just name check there. So what's your perspective?
So a good payment system on credit card, on PayPal. When I said a good payment system, I mean a payment system which has tackled seriously and efficiently the fraud issue, still have between 1% and 3% of fraud. So first, we need to understand that when we are doing money with a system, when we are operating payment, we are facing a risk of fraud. That's the first thing to have clearly in mind. Fraud exists, if you have to accept that, and you have to put the resources to tackle that. On mobile advertising, where the fraud is less issues and create less pain for the customers because it do not end up with a false payment, but just fake impressions. On mobile advertising, it's well known that between 5 to 10% of the inventories are fraudulent. It means that when British Telecom buy advertising on the advertising market, between 5 and 10% of their media buys are stolen by fraudsters. And it's a huge issue. Why? Because crime has getting more and more professionalized and so on. Regarding carrier billing, since it's quite a new payment system using very innovative devices that still lacks some part of protection in a very open world. When you are not well protected, it can really go up to 20% or more than 20% very quickly. And when you raise this barrier, when you raise this limit, and you are up this limit, then all the market can collapse. And you can have up to 80% and it collapses very quickly. When you tackle fraud correctly, you can lower down to 3-5%. And that's what we try to achieve with our partners.
How often have you seen it reach those very, very high levels?
Every time, in every country, in every market, when because the operators, the stakeholders, they needed the pain, they needed to face the fraud to understand it exists and to understand they have to do something with it. So every time, on every market, at some point, you go through this journey of having a lot of fraud and having to hurry in finding solutions, or cutting your business for a while, trying to figure out what to do.
Okay, so let's continue to go around the world. So John, what's your perspective on the state of fraud at the moment?
Well, at Aegis, our specialization is on the consumer side of fraud, and we first got engaged during the premium SMS days when there was a very high prevalence of fraud that was resulting in high complaints and high refunds, and so we have been involved with the U.S. carriers in putting together very comprehensive full life cycle plans regarding the players and the content, and monitoring on an ongoing basis, and also monitoring the results of purchases. So due to some very, let's say, extreme regulatory actions and penalties that were levied, it's being taken very seriously. So on the consumer side of it, I think we've made some very good strides against it, but it's an ongoing battle because there are so many players out there and so many ways to commit fraud. I have personally less exposure to what's happening on the other side, on the technical side, that's really impacting directly against the providers, the content providers, and the aggregators. But from the consumer front, we have seen rates come down, but again, it is an ongoing battle.
Well, John, as you correctly point out, and as David indicated as well, there's different flavors of fraud here. You can talk about fraud that impacts customers because money coming out of their bank accounts, and there's also fraud that affects content providers where they're advertising fraud, and fighting against fraudsters who are trying to steal their clicks or get them to pay for clicks that don't exist, and so on. So, Anzelle, I'll come to you. But briefly tell us, what your impression is of how prevalent fraud is, especially in, I believe you're quite strong in Africa as markets. And then we'll come on to defining some of these fraud types.
Yeah, so you already touched on the subject, starting with, the different players in the ecosystem, and this is something that's well defined in the white paper as well, is how they are respectively affected by this problem. So as a content provider, I think the first and foremost issue is the brand being tarnished. Ultimately, if you are selling a product that you invested a lot in and worked hard to develop to end users who then call in, and this is something Oliver and John both said, call in and complain that they didn't opt in or they didn't want to subscribe, the first thing that does is tarnishes your reputation and the reputation of the brand, also of the MNO. But certainly also of the content provider. So there's certainly a strong reputational element. Secondly, there's a financial element to it because we, of course, invest heavily in advertising to attract new consumers and to attract new subscribers to our products and services. Now, often when refunds, as they are inevitably given to anybody who in most markets to anybody who complains or disputes the fact that there was a legitimate subscription, are paid 100% out of the pocket of the content provider. And secondly, the negative churn or the unsubscription rate of users who are unhappy with the product, or who are not with the product, but unhappy with how they felt they came to have the product, is much higher. These users tend to unsubscribe, within 24 hours, something like 80% of these subscribers. And of course, we would never see a return on investment on a subscriber that we paid, the full buck for acquiring, that unsubscribes because he feels he's been defrauded. I think that's the main impact, the three main impacts on content providers. So
why don't you walk us through some of the different kinds of frauds that are committed against consumers? I think that was one of your contributions to the white paper, was defining.
Sure. So when we started drafting the white paper, we agreed as a working group that whilst for a large part it will speak to what we call technical fraud, and this is typically the occurrence of some sort of malware or technical intervention causing to entirely remove or almost entirely remove the end user's interaction with the payment acquisition flow. We decided that we'd be remiss if we don't also address the other side of the fence, where the end user or the consumer still interacts in some way, shape, or form during the process of purchasing the product, but is somehow misled or is somehow duped into completing a purchase in a non-technical manner. So when we talk about non-technical fraud, and it's again outlined in the white paper as well, we've sort of categorized them in four main categories. You've got misinformation, disinformation, trust manipulation, and if I get to the fourth one shortly. So
misleading incentive.
Misleading incentive. So misinformation and disinformation typically come down to the instances where pricing information is omitted. The overuse or overemphasis on things like get a free game here, get a free download, and typically things that would lead a user to complete a purchase that he wouldn't otherwise have done. Trust manipulation is things like passing off or using a well-known brand, and sometimes even the brand of the MVNO, to say, we see that you shop at Woolworths on a weekly basis, please complete this survey, and then ultimately the user is led into a subscription service. Misleading incentive is one where I think the most prevalent is your phone has a virus, and click here to clean it. Anything that a user thinks, okay, if I complete this transaction, I will receive incentive X or Y, and then ultimately is led into a subscription service that was never the intention, and was also never the intention of the merchant or the content provider for their service to be advertised in such a manner. So I think when we break fraud as a whole down into technical and non-technical, these are the most important non-technical aspects, and of course you can deal with these in a range of manners, including commercial, contractual requirements. But as far as technical fraud is concerned, I think it's clear that needs a strong technical anti-fraud solution.
Right. Okay. We'll come on to that. Oliver, what do you do to prevent any merchants that you're working with from committing these kinds of non-technical frauds?
So there's a bunch of different things. I mean, clearly we work with merchants who we trust, firstly. So, before we'll contract with any merchant, we'll go through a due diligence process, ensure that the people responsible for that business are people who are known in industry, who have not had any sort of red and black marks against them. The due diligence side of things is first and foremost the kind of the primary step. And beyond that, then we start to look at the service flows and the actual creation of the service and the consumer acquisition journeys that can be put live. And obviously they have to conform to the very least the regulation and the M&O requirements in the territory. And we then apply our own sort of flavour to that. So we'll have a template, for example, for a DCB flow that we feel meets the requirements and perhaps sets it maybe a step above the sort of the base level. And then thirdly, in market, we have to conduct auditing. So we work with either an audit house or our own internal audit, and we will make sure that we're accessing the service as a consumer would, trying to put in and discoveries of the advertisement that's being placed, and make sure the consumer journeys are exactly as they were purported to be. And if we ever do knock up against an issue, we have to take that up with the merchant involved. I think one point I did want to just raise very quickly, and I think Anzelle touched on it, a lot of the focus from MNOs and regulators especially is on the merchant. You know, the buck stops with the merchant. We have to protect consumers from fraud. But I think that it's really important to highlight here that actually 9 times out of 10 probably the financial victim, and to the heaviest extent, is often the merchant. Because if a consumer complains, the merchant's refunding at 100%. You know, they've had cuts taken on network by the aggregator, and they're refunding out 100% to the consumer. They potentially paid for bad clicks, or they paid for advertising or cost of acquisition out to third parties. So I think it's really important actually that everybody looks at this from a sort of an objective set of eyes, and when fraud is discovered, what's the flow of cash? Because often it's the fraudster that's picking up you know, a significant chunk more cash than the merchant might, and although the consumer might pay for a subscription to a service, you know, the kind of the pain that's felt is very much sitting at the feet of the merchant.
Oliver, can you talk about, you mentioned some of the payment flows. Are you able to talk about the different options in terms of like a click-based payment or a PIN-based payment or a message-originated payment and so on? Can you walk us through some of those?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, market by market, there's going to be differences. There are huge similarities as well, but as each market will have its own flavour. So fundamentally, we're looking at a click flow, and that might be a one-click flow. So it might be advertising leading into a click to confirm a purchase, and then a thank you very much, leading the customer then on to the content. Certainly here in the UK, we have a two-click opt-in, two-step flow. So it's a click to buy and then a click to confirm the transaction, and the consumer then enters the content. Special conditions here in the UK play a part, and that brings in PIN that you've mentioned. And PIN can be in 2 forms, so either an SMS PIN, so it's advertising, click to buy. If your header enriched, so your mobile numbers been passed by the network, you'll receive an SMS with a PIN. You can enter that onto the confirm page and then click confirm, or you may see an on-screen PIN. Lots of variations on a similar theme. So fundamentally, about two click with a PIN is the most prevalent.
Do you find there are big differences in the amount of payment abandonment that results from the different methods?
Yes. So if you look at a straight 2-click flow without the use of a PIN, compared to a 2-click flow with a PIN, we see abandonment probably 85 to 90% of the traffic drops off in a PIN flow compared to a straight 2-click flow.
And would you say that's because people are confused about what's going on, or because they change their mind about making a purchase, or what's going on there?
I hope not. I mean, from my mind, I think mobile billing has always been seen as an impulse purchase. So it's advertising that's seen by a consumer. They're browsing online. They think, yeah, that looks great. They'll click to buy it. And as soon as there's a pin or a step in the flow that adds too much friction, it makes them think about the purchase a little more. So it doesn't necessarily mean they weren't informed about the fact that there were costs or the regularity of the charge, but we don't want them to stop. You know, the analogy that's always used is somebody at the checkout and they see a packet of chewing gum, they'll grab it, they'll stick it on the conveyor belt and they'll check out. You perhaps need to think a little bit more about which fruit and veg you want. I don't know whether that quite ties, but you get the point.
I might add that it's well known, for instance, by Amazon investigations and studies, that every time you add just 100 milliseconds to a customer journey, you add 2 to 3, you lose between 2 to 3% of the conversion rates. So imagine we are in a payment solution where between being able to just click and doing your purchase, here you have to click to have the SMS, or to click first, then to type your mobile phone number, then to not have any issues, to not have any disruption, to do not forget, to do not have done any error while typing your MSCSD, and then you click. And then it goes to a server that has the charge to send the SMS, and then you hope that the SMS arrive. You have spent tens and tens of seconds that decrease a lot the conversion rate. And that would be the same if that was an Amazon payment. And it's well analyzed.
Yeah, yeah.
If I can add to what David just said, leading on to what Oliver was saying, is I think that's also what this white paper aims to do, is to show that simply adding more levels into the payment flow as a knee-jerk reaction, with whatever good intentions it may have been from the carrier or the regulator or whoever is involved in defining the flow. But what this white paper goes to show is that simply adding more levels in that flow, firstly, creates a barrier to purchase, and secondly, is no guarantee for lowering the cases of fraudulent subscriptions that result from it.
Yeah.
I think the attempts to introduce pins in flows to make flows more difficult for a consumer to navigate through are attempts to resolve the technical fraud that's being perpetrated. And the better approach is to get the anti-fraud approach correct. To deploy anti-fraud within the billing pages, in the billing flow for the consumer, to ensure that the consumer is coming through a flow that is clean, and it's them that are clicking the buttons and doing what they need to do. David's got some great examples of being able to reopen two-click flows in markets which have had really poor experience of fraud affecting the market, huge levels of complaint, and actually where anti-fraud is approached and deployed in the correct manner, being able to open the flow back to consumers who want to buy the product, they're happy to buy the product. It means you can revert to sort of decent click-through rates. Advertisers can make their margins. Content partners can show services that are generating a decent return on investment. And with the correct use of anti-fraud, we can help to depress those complaints from consumers coming through at the tail end.
Okay.
It's a difficult balancing act because a lot of different approaches have been tried, kind of similar to the PIN, but in trying to reduce the friction of receiving a PIN, there have been approaches tried to say, well, the customer can simply enter their billing postal code. And what we find is that sometimes customers are not completely aware of what correct billing postal code was entered as part of their account setup. And so that has also that's resulted in friction and purchase abandonment, and in some cases just complete abandonment of DCB for that customer entirely. So it is a very difficult trick to minimize the friction, maximize the revenue, and still keep everything clean.
What about biometrics? Has that ever been attempted? John, I don't know if you...
I'm trying to think. I'm not aware of any use cases where it's been deployed in any kind of volume.
It's allowable, certainly in the UK market, but I don't think there's any live examples.
But adding to John's example about users not knowing their postal code, if you look at mobile wallet payments in Ghana, for example, a user wanting or attempting to make a mobile wallet payment is required firstly to it's happening.
Yeah, everyone's smiling because David said that it was easier to combat fraud than combat your children coming in when you're online. So he's proved that right. Anyway, back to you, Anzelle.
Yeah, so just getting back to this example of more steps in the flow creating friction. The mobile wallet payment flow in Ghana requires a user firstly to enter their MSICN, and they receive an MT containing a PIN, and then the page says enter your PIN. And then after that, they're required to enter their mobile money PIN, which is the PIN from your bank account. And then it says again, now enter your PIN. And then what you see 99% of people doing is re-entering the empty PIN that they just received. And it's this like confusing elements, and merchants then, try and go the extra mile by explaining it on the page and whatever. But again, the more friction that comes in there, and this is something that could relatively easily be prevented. Right,
okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the technical frauds. So we talked about kind of the consumer deception a little bit. But when it comes to some of the mobile ad fraud that David was talking about earlier, I mean, on the white paper, there's a technical annex, and it's a very long list of types of fraud. So we can't go through it all now. But why don't you just kind of, David, give us an overview of the main types of technical fraud that is committed in the advertising space?
Yes, it was important for the working group to try to do something very comprehensive. So that's why on the annex, you can have a lot of information that can be shared with your technical team, that can be very interesting for them and so on. But also, I think it's part 3. I'm almost sure it's on the part 3 of the white paper. We have something that is a summary of what are the very big kinds of fraud and the big categories. First, you have the malicious apps. These are apps that can be on the Google Store, that can be on alternative store. And these apps, they fake, these are games, these are wallpaper apps, these are ringtones apps that on the background take the control of your device and perform the subscription on your behalf. So this is the first kind of technical fraud that we can have, these kinds of malicious apps. And what the anti-fraud company like ours do is that we develop a very deep learning algorithm that are able to detect those malware, and that's the first thing. A second thing could be done by the fraudulent advertisers. They can inject in the URLs some piece of code that will be exploited to do code injection in the landing pages of the advertisers, changing the layout at the advertiser, at the merchant side, changing the size of the buttons, erasing the price, or even being able to click on the behalf of the customer as soon as the customer has landed on the advertiser page. I would also add that the malicious apps are able to grab any SMS code and enter them in forms. So that's very easy. And that's not only targeting carrier billing, it's targeting all kinds of APIs where a user has to share its consent. You also have a kind of fraud which is called clickjacking. Here, it's techniques that are able to capture your click on your device and to replay this click on the merchant side. And last but not least, you have all the spoofing kind of fraud. These are techniques where the fraudsters are able to disguise themselves as the end user, sometimes because they have access to the network or some credentials, and they spoof the identity of a real customer and make purchase on his behalf. That would be the 4 main categories that we have addressed in the first part of the white paper, and then all those categories are more detailed in the annex.
Yeah. Okay, and so what does your company do, Evina, to combat these types of fraud?
We are really passionate about ethical hacking and how to block those bad guys. What we do first is that we have mobile honeypots. It means that in several countries we have devices that are here to get infected. They go into the worst affiliate networks. They go into the worst advertising platform. They install the worst rated apps, and they crawl on all the buttons they are incentive to click. And we gather several signals about the fact that the battery is drained, that the data plan is drained, that the mobile wallet is drained, and we analyze those viruses. Then, thanks to this analysis, we extract fingerprints of how those malware behave, and we are able then to put on the page of our customers sensors that are able to recognize those patterns and those fingerprints. We also have a cyber threat intelligence activity It means that we have several MNOs or several important merchants as customer, and we track on the dark web if there is any malicious kit targeting specifically their platform. We buy on with Bitcoin those malware in order to understand how they work and in order to build the protections against it. And as I said, we developed sensors that are able to, on the pages of our customer, grab all the details of what is going on, challenge libraries, challenge device identity. So we can grab data points, and we will analyze it with the results, with the churn rates, with the complaint rates of our customer, in order to identify if we have fingerprints that can be related to new kinds of fraud. We have very nice explanations. We do a lot of reverse engineering of malware. So on our website, evina.com/newsroom, you can find, if you are a tech guy or if you like these kinds of things, a lot of reverse engineering done by my team against all these kinds of malware. Okay.
It's probably a never-ending task, I would imagine, just staying ahead of the fraudsters. So John, what about your system for mitigating against fraud? Maybe you can just briefly explain how that works.
Sure. So the first thing that we try to address, we have a full life cycle approach, the first part of which is making sure that you know who is coming into your market, who are the players who are trying to act as merchants and developers underneath the direct aggregators that you're working with as an MNO. And so we do deep behavioral background investigations, and because we don't have to be governed entirely by legalistic evidence, we go beyond just lawsuits and go into a lot of say perhaps less official sources that allow us to, for example, a lot of spamming does not end up in a lawsuit. But there are networks out there that are watchdog networks looking for spam. So we do take advantage of things like that, as well as social media connections and all the information that's available in terms of open source browsing to really get a good picture of who it is and how they behaved. We take a look at where the key business people have operated in the past, how they've been related to various companies and to various people, who then may in turn be related to other bad players. And so we take advantage of technologies like graph databases and things like that for relationship connections. The next step is to take a look at the actual content that they propose to bring on board. And so where we can, we have a pre-launch onboarding process, and it really depends upon our customer and the market. In some cases, they already have content that is already launched, and we have to do it after the fact. But we wherever we can, we try to get a preview of it, or at least a pre-description before it goes into market. And we work very collaboratively with the aggregators and the merchants to try to make sure that when they launch material that they understand what compliance is, so that we've established a compliant baseline. And then we do anonymous in-market monitoring. When we know the whole portfolio, we actually monitor the entire portfolio. Where that becomes more difficult is in some of the Play stores. Obviously, we have no control over who the Google developers are, or the developers underneath Google or Microsoft or any of the other large Play stores. So we have to use a different approach to that, including statistical sampling processes. But to try to target all of that, we also take a look at business results, such as purchases, refunds from various sources. And we use that to help target our monitoring, as well as do some transaction level analysis after the fact to take a look at how purchases are trending. One interesting thing that has come out of a lot of that work and a lot of the fraud investigations that may come out of, say, high refund rates or high trends is that sometimes it's difficult to separate customer behavior from actual fraud. What's kind of interesting in trying to make that separation is that you'll find that there are certain viral games or viral in-app purchases that are extremely expensive. And as we all know, our teenagers are a lot more technologically savvy than we may be. So in a lot of cases, refunds may result more from family behavior and circumvention of permission than actual fraud, which is often the case in some of the very high profile, $99 purchases that an 11-year-old makes, and then said, what in the world did you do? And in order to get a refund, the customer may come back and say, oh, I didn't authorize that purchase. Well, that wasn't actually fraud. That was a lack of control, familial control. So then we also apply some transaction level fraud analytics to try to take a look at some of the patterns and outliers that help us then retarget our monitoring efforts on particular areas in addition to random sampling. We do very targeted sampling as well.
So John raises an interesting question there about, how do we know when a fraud is really a fraud, and what should we do when there's some kind of grey area? So Oliver, what would you, what's your experience in terms of like giving consumers the benefit of the doubt, essentially, when it comes to refunds and things like that?
Yeah, it's twofold. So for some customers, we provide frontline customer care on their behalf. So where a customer raises a complaint to us and says, I didn't subscribe, it wasn't me, I know nothing about it, we will always go away and investigate their claims. So the first thing that we need to do is work with the merchant to understand, what banner was it that the consumer clicked on? Were they watching a YouTube video? What was the advert they saw? What did the pages look like? And obviously we maintain logs. We record screenshots of the pages the customers interacted with. If there's been an MO or any kind of interaction with the flow from a consumer, from a messaging perspective, we have the logs for those interactions. We then record all of the interactions from the service once the subscription's in place. So if we've delivered spend reminders or receipts, have they delivered correctly to the consumer's handset? I mean, we certainly don't advocate a blanket refund policy. I don't think it's the right thing to do, because I don't think that helps anybody. But there are certain instances where a consumer has complained, they know nothing of the service, they might have received spend reminders, but they've put them down to being spam messages and deleted them. So it does often come down to having a conversation and getting a gut feel of whether or not you think their claim is genuine. And there are certainly customers who just try and milk the system. They've been online, they've seen a bit of Google coaching, they've been told to say certain things. It wasn't me, it was my kid. I didn't interact with the service after I bought it. There's certainly not a lot of help online to sort of make sure that we're able to sort of cut between the wheat and the chaff. But certainly it's a fairly manual process, complaint by complaint, to review and make sure that we've got adequate backup to justify the charges that have been placed on the consumer's bill.
What about you, Anzelle? What's your approach to that, and how prevalent is it in your markets?
Well, from a merchant perspective, I think Oliver already touched on something where the aggregator or the MNO, I think in the first instance reach out to the merchant and ask, what can you provide? And I think in the past, for the most part, post acquisition, after the user subscribed, if we look at typical VAS content for merchants, it was like a black hole. Like, you don't know what the subscriber then does on your portal, what's he downloading, what's he looking at. And serious merchants, or serious content providers, I can put it that way, have invested and are moving towards products and services where we can track every interaction using the same ID for a user from the moment he clicks on the banner that we serve, be it on Google or Facebook or whatever advertisement ultimately led him to our service. Using that same ID, that runs like a golden thread through his entire lifetime, through the subscription flow, but also post-subscription through the course of his life cycle and his interaction with the product. So being able to see where he clicked, what he was downloading, what he was watching, even after subscription and through the course of his lifetime. And that also allows us to be able to, on the basis of that, and on the basis of that, excuse me, interaction of the user that's recorded and mapped through the course of the whole interaction, to be able to ascertain, you know, whether or not this is something that's really questionable as a potential fraud case, or whether it's indeed an actual end user who's you know 11-year-old has had his mobile phone.
What about the data protection elements of having that ID?
Sure.
I mean, so, there's you know, these IDs are all being phased out now, aren't they?
Exactly. So, well, firstly, this is okay. Take a step back, because we can have a whole entire webinar about this alone. But as far as the VAS business is concerned as a whole, merchant providers act as data processors, because ultimately we receive either an MS-ISDN or some unique sort of encryptor through which we can identify the end user. The question was raised in many markets in South Africa in terms of the POPI, which is their local sort of GDPR, and of course also GDPR here. Is an MS-ISDN alone, can it be considered personal information? The answer is yes, because it is identifiable. The ability exists for the end user to be identified. For us, and I think for most other merchants in our position, it's pretty clear. We require that identifier, so that MS-ISDN or that unique key, to be able to deliver on our side of the deal. So to be able to provide this content to the end user, because we need to process his payment, else we can't deliver him, you know, what he's paying for. Secondly, GDPR, for example, doesn't state an exact amount of time on which you're allowed to keep this data post that commercial relationship ending. So we call that the unsubscription moment. But again, it's important to be able, when the carrier or the aggregator or the end user themselves contacts you a reasonable period or amount of time down the line, wanting a refund, for example, or wanting some information about how the subscription took place, to be able to answer, you know, to be able to answer to that. So I think in our industry, retention of data like MS-ISDNs and other identifiers can, in terms of GDPR at least, and POPI, be easily justified as being retained for at least a period of 3 to 5 years in order to speak to them.
Okay. Well, as you said, that's a whole other topic, isn't it? We haven't got long left, so I want to, in the report, there are some case studies of with varying levels of success of tackling fraud, and especially when it comes to putting technical solutions in place. So David, if I can come back to you, maybe you can tell us about some of the work you've done with customers and what kind of success you've had with putting your fraud solution in place.
Yes, we have been working with several MNOs to date. We were about to close mobile payment because they were overwhelmed by fraud. We were talking about the fact that how do you handle customer complaints? Do you refund? Is it family fraud? Is it problem of permission and so on? But you cannot state that when you are above 10–15% of complaints. You have to refund everyone, and then it's become a mess. There is no business case, and so on. So Brick Telecom was somewhere at this stage about they decided to switch from 2 clicks flows, so very, very simple and very, very powerful in terms of service added for the customer and for the merchants and for the whole ecosystem, to PIN codes with code verifications and so on. And it ended up that it didn't lower down the fraud, because at the end of the day, the malware, they are still able to pass all the obstacles, and only the customers are fed up and abandoned before the end of the journey. They were about to shut down, and it was 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago they were about to shut down, and we were feeling that. So that's why 3 years ago we started the company. They installed Evina. In a few weeks, they decreased their complaint rates by 2. They decreased their fraud attempts by 14. They were able to get back from a very heavy flow to something really smooth and very simple and powerful. And today, they are doing more business. The media bias restrictions are less complicated than in a lot of countries. So from this success, we went to Orange and did the same thing. We had very huge success with Proximus in Belgium as well, in Cameroon as well. So yes, as soon as you accept that fraud is an issue and you should equip yourself with everything that has been said in terms of managing your partners correctly, knowing your customer, making sure you can control what the merchants are doing on their page and so on. As soon as you have done all of this and you put the good technical solution as well, you can keep simple and powerful subscription and payment system, and you can save a big and highly margin and highly profitable business that help your economy to grow. And in this context today, it's very important. It's very important. Mobile payment today is more important than ever. So that's why it's very, very exciting to be in this.
So very quickly, David, because we don't have much time left. How can you be sure that you're not blocking legitimate traffic with your solutions?
That's a very important question, because when you block the conversions at the very last moment, you block a customer that has gone through a strong journey, that has cost a lot for the merchant, that has cost a lot technically, and if you fail to identify, and if you identify him as a fraudster or as a fraud while it's not, you're losing a lot of money. So that's really one of our obsession. And how do we achieve that? We achieve that by having a strong, a very strong overview and analysis of the fraud rates. And when we update our platform, every time we do and inject new fraud patterns into our platform on a daily basis, we have several indicators. We have some traffic sources that are better than others. And if we see a peak in terms of fraud rates on a traffic source that should be very, very good, we know it's important to work on it. We are listening very, very carefully to the customer reports. When the customer is blocked on a panel, he has a little link to say, oh, I don't know why I've been blocked. So we can grab this data to investigate.
Okay. And John, if I can come to you, maybe you can just briefly tell us about some of the successes that you've had.
Sure. As I mentioned, our injection into the DCB market came on the heels of some pretty bad times in premium SMS. And so we assisted our customers in complying with some pretty stringent regulatory requirements and injected a lot of the full life cycle monitoring piece. So in the US market, we've been very successful in getting getting the complaint rates and the refund rates down very low. In general, refund rates are below 2%. Overall, and that doesn't mean that we've not everybody who has a problem makes a complaint or requests a refund, but it's a pretty good indicator relative to what we had seen previously, and it just takes constant vigilance, and as I think we've all agreed that sometimes it can be difficult distinguishing between customer behavior issues and actual fraud, but I think we've been able to really clean things up quite a bit. The other very important piece, and it kind of relates to what David was talking about in terms of making sure that you preserve good revenue, is being as surgical as possible about takedowns and shutdowns, and really establishing tight relationships as best you can with the various providers in the chain, with the aggregators, with the Play stores. We actually have some very strong relationships with Play stores and have some very collaborative work going on there that helps keep the market clean. I think everybody now, all the legitimate players, understand how beneficial it is and how much money there is to be made when you can make a clean market. So we've gotten some very good cooperation and collaboration. We also work with some providers outside of the US, so we work in Canada and Australia as well. We've had the same sorts of experiences. You know, in a lot of cases that has shrunk the portfolios, but when you have a clean portfolio and you can count on that revenue, it makes a big difference. And just very quickly responding to some of the questions that I'm seeing, and what Anzelle was saying about how long you have to retain information. We've had some of the regulators have required us to go back and analyze data for on the order of 8 years or so. So it is a very difficult problem, you know, to balance the privacy issues against the you know, regulatory requirements and refund requirements.
So John was responding to a viewer question, which is what would be considered a reasonable period for a MISDN to be subscribed to a service before they'd not be considered for a refund? And would this differ between pre and post-paid? So I don't know if anyone's got anything to add to what John said there.
Yeah, I will, if that's okay. I think it's possibly the wrong way to look at it. I think that the longer a consumer sticks with a subscription, the less likely they would be to say that they knew nothing about it because they should have received multiple spend reminders. However, I suspect that the justification as to whether a refund is due or not would be more likely to be based on whether or not that consumer's interacted with the service. So as Anzelle said, you know, quite rightly, the easiest case for us is to be able to receive a complaint from the consumer and turn around and say, you've downloaded this, you've played that, you typed in this username and this password, and you deleted it, and you did something different. And to actually keep a dossier of information to be able to turn to the consumer and say, we know it was you, you used this service, and I'm really terribly sorry, but a refund is not due. So yeah, I don't think any length of time needs to pass for that consumer to no longer be eligible. But yeah, the more information as a merchant you can present, the better case you'll have not to refund that consumer.
I think from a common sense perspective, I agree with you, Oliver, but we have seen that sometimes regulators wouldn't necessarily follow common sense. And so we've actually had to go back and we've had customers who have had to issue refunds from way back in 2013.
Yeah, we've had the same. We've had instances where regulators issued a blanket refund because there's been a very small percentage of the base that have been by an issue, for instance. But hopefully, you know, those cases are in the minority.
Right, and I think there's also there's a distinguishing factor between subscriptions and one-time purchases.
Sure.
So.
And one more question from a viewer, which was, how do we make sure payments are not done by minors? Most of the complaints that this person noticed, it was the parents saying that their kids had subscribed. So how could you combat this? Anzelle, have you got anything to say there?
Yeah, I think, again, differentiating between what is common sense and what's required by regulation or by law. Of course, any service would have its terms and conditions, and in the terms and conditions would say that by subscribing to the service, you agree that you're of whatever legal age is in the market, and fine, we can have all these things in place. But at the end of the day, there's no actual technical or tangible physical way to prevent a child from taking his parent's phone and subscribing to something. So it's something that when it comes to things like refunds, we consider on a case-to-case basis, but at the same time, you also don't necessarily want certain services to be consumed by children or whatever. So in many markets, operators include a separate age verification step if the content type requires it. So then you would have either a second page on the web flow or whatever saying, please confirm your age. But from a practical point of view, you can look at including things in your T's and C's. What you don't want to do if you're selling games, which can be enjoyed by anyone of any age, is include an extra step in the subscription flow to verify age. Also, there's a difference between a 3-year-old and a 17-year-old. So a 17-year-old might not be of legal age in most countries, but I think it's considered freely that somebody opting in using their parents' handset, there's an implicit or sort of unspoken agreement, if we're using the same house and you're using my phone, that it's with my permission.
Yeah.
I think also, sorry, just if I may jump in there, I think there's two other things as well. Every territory has a blacklist, so placements of advertising in kids' channels on YouTube, for instance, they can clearly be avoided. You've got less likelihood that a child is going to be watching a video and seeing your ad. That's a good and prudent thing to do. I think also that when adults hand their phone to a child, a lot of the algorithms that Google work to assume that it's the adult that's still using that phone. So I think it is quite difficult at times to prevent a child. So there's got to be some parental responsibility taken. Yeah. If my child subscribes to a service on my phone, I have to take that on the chin. I think it's up to the parent often to put preventative measures in place to assure that their children cannot click, cannot do certain things. There's guided access on the phone for good reason on an iPhone. So I think it's, as I've said, take prudent steps. It's not
well. Look out for the working group's next report, which is how to be a better parent. Anyway, we've had a great hour of conversation, and we're lucky that we can say to all of our viewers that if they want to know more, they can read the report. So that's good. So with that, I will say thank you to David, Oliver, Anzelle, and John. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you for everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
See you next time. Bye.